What's going on, guys? Today I'm going to be talking about if melee is worth it for an average player to get. If you guys are maybe looking at melee and you wonder if you should pick it up, hopefully this video will help you make that decision, kind of talking about the pros and cons of melee and what's done well, what's not done well, and all of the different pieces of gear that really make up the melee set. So if this video helps you guys make a decision onto whether you get melee or not, definitely let me know in the comments below, and let's get right into it. All right, guys, so now I'm going to be going over probably what it would be considered the minimum gear you need for best in slot melee. So I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. But as you can see here, this is what the gear looks like. And then there are a few or a lot of switches and different random stuff that you could use with melee. But for the gear, Vestments of Havoc, really strong with melee. This is like your Dracolich armor set. It has 3 different adrenaline effects as well as extending Berserk by 6 seconds. So as you can imagine, this is ridiculously strong. It also has tier 115 melee power damage. So that's pretty decent as well, although power armor, the damage bonus from it's kind of small, but whatever. You're also going to need a Grimoire. Like all the combat styles besides Necromancy, it's fully reliant on the critical strike buff. Melee doesn't really need it to function as much as something like range or magic, but it is still like so powerful that you might as well use it. And then the Zuck Cape, really strong with melee. The Zuck Cape is absurd. Overpower can hit 60,000 damage in one ability. It's just crazy how good the Zuck Cape is with melee now. For the EOF, the main EOF we use is going to be Dragon Claws. As you can see, we do have a switch for EOF, and that is going to be for the EZK, but we'll get into that later. For the quiver slot here, you can see we have a bunch of armor spikes. I'm hoping we get more different types of these armor spikes in the future, but for now, we just have the Abyssal armor spikes, so you might as well use these. They give a little tiny bleed, which can be pretty decent. For the weapons, the main weapons we use are going to be the tier 95 Lengs. These are really decent now. They're much better than they were in the beta. The way the special attack works actually makes sense now, unlike the beta version. But yeah, these, the special attack costs 0 adrenaline and it hits pretty hard. So yeah, these are really good. They also have a nice little passive to give you a little bit of extra damage. For the gloves, we use the Gloves of Passage with the enchantment. These are really good, especially if you're going into a bleed build or a bleed rotation. As you can see, it makes the target take 20% increased damage from bleeds for 10 seconds, and then that's boosted a further 5% after you use the Smash or Havoc ability. So yeah, as you can imagine, 25% increased bleed damage is pretty crazy, especially once we get into a bunch of the bleed buffs that we have. And then finally, the ring, the Champion's Ring with the enchantment is pretty decent. It's definitely the best ring for melee, but I think a Reaver's Ring is fine as well. This is like the last upgrade you should probably get, to be honest. So there are a lot of switches for melee that you can use. The main switches we have, though, are going to be the Masterwork Spear of Annihilation. This just extends your bleeds by 50%. So obviously this is really strong when we're going into a bleed build. We also have the Jaws of the Abyss, which we're not really going to talk about what this helmet looks like. But yeah, so basically this helmet gives you more adrenaline for every bleed that you have on. It makes your basics deal 2% more, or give you 2% more adrenaline per bleed. So if you have like 3 bleeds, your basics are going to be generating a ton of adrenaline, which is obviously very strong when we go into our bleed rotation. And then finally for the bleeds, we have the EZK EOF. Unfortunately, you do need to put the EZK into an EOF. It's really dumb that this is designed like this, but it is what it is. The EZK is okay on its own, but obviously if you're increasing the duration of the bleed by 50%, that makes the EZK actually really strong. So you do really want to be putting that into an EOF, unfortunately. Some other stuff that's really good for melee that isn't like super required, I would say, is going to be the Scourge. The Scourge is pretty decent if you're just going to be like revoing a boss down or like doing an AFK method or something like that. So yeah, the Scourge seems pretty decent, but I don't think it's like super required for most stuff. Same thing with the Zeros Godsword. It's kind of niche, but where it works, it's pretty decent. Basically, what the Zeros Godsword does is it puts a black hole on the ground, and much like Sunshine or something like that, you stand in the black hole and do increased melee damage. It's 50% increased damage rather than 100% like Zerk. But if you are doing a boss where like bleeds aren't very good or something like that, the black hole spec can be pretty decent. The Dragon Battle Axe is also really good. It just gives you a nice little special attack at the War's Retreat Crystal where you can buff for free and get a minute-long buff and do just insane damage. And then the Scrimshaw Vampirism is also pretty decent with melee. If you're not going to be using a Grimoire, you might as well use something like this to be getting just ridiculous heals. And then finally, the Dragon Two-Hander, you put this in an EOF. I didn't really find a use for this, so I didn't buy the EOF yet, to be honest. But if you're doing something like Gladecore with melee or something like that, this could be really good. Obviously, I don't know. There's not really that much stuff that you AoE like that in this game at like bosses. So I didn't really find that many uses for it. But if there is a boss that comes out in the future or something like that where you have to be AoEing a ton, the Dragon Two-Hander is definitely very strong for that. So finally, there are a few abilities that are very good with melee. As you can see right here, these are the abilities. Mainly, we are going to be using Greater Barge. Greater Barge is super good with melee. It allows your rotations to be much more clean. You're not sitting there channeling during your Berserk and wasting a bunch of time. Basically, Greater Barge will, you wait a second, you barge, and then it turns your next channeled ability into a damage over time instead, so you can go into a further rotation without having to sit there and waste a bunch of time channeling, like I said. And then Greater Fury is really good with melee now. Greater Fury makes your next ability Critical Strike guaranteed, and this can obviously be very good if you're going into a Critical Strike buff rotation. You can use this before Overpower and make the first hit Critical Strike, so it does a lot more damage for free. So yeah, this is a really good ability. Greater Flurry can be kind of decent. It reduces the cooldown of Berserk by up to 4.8 seconds, which obviously is really, really strong. And then Chaos Roar is super good with melee. This ability makes like Overpower or Dragon Claw or something hit absurdly hard, and it's relatively cheap, so you might as well get it. It basically just doubles the damage of your next ability. So yeah, really, really good. Alright, so to get into this video, I'm just going to have some random melee combat footage I was doing in the background here while I talk. So to start out, the first talking point of this video is going to be the ease of use of melee combat. And I think melee combat is a relatively decent middle ground between necromancy and ranged, where it's significantly easier to use than ranged, but obviously it's way harder than necromancy because I mean, you kind of just AFK, like you could literally leave the room and get almost a top tier damage rotation with necromancy out. So yeah, it's obviously not that easy, but it is a nice middle ground between the two, I think. As far as the switches are concerned, there is less overall switching you have to do with melee, and a lot of the switching is more like simple, like it's, you know, you camp dual wields and an EOF, and then once your Berserk runs out, you switch your EOF and switch to a 2H, and then you go into like a bleed rotation, Meteor Strike, and then switch back to your dual wields. And then you can kind of like start weaving dual wield to 2H switches in there if you want, but it's not super necessary. So as far as the switches are concerned, it is a little bit less intensive from switching, from a switching perspective as well. But there are a lot of different switches that you can bring with melee to start doing more and more and more damage, or like for other little like maybe a certain mechanic for a certain boss or something like that. So there are more things you can bring and more switches that are available. But from what I've found, most of those switches aren't super necessary unless you're really trying to push like the absolute maximum damage out, which most people probably aren't going to do. So yeah, I think the switching situation with melee is a lot better than range, for example. But again, obviously it does have more switching than something like necromancy. As for the damage you take, I think this kind of fits into the ease of use category here. Obviously, when you berserk, you take double damage, so that can definitely be a bit of an issue, I think, especially when you're learning a boss or learning melee in general. It can be kind of annoying to just like be sitting there taking, double the damage, like getting hit extremely hard through prayer and stuff like that. It is kind of annoying that it's like set up like this. And to make matters even worse, the Vestments of Havoc have tier 70 armor rating, so you pretty much get hit by every single hit. They max hit every time, so it kind of double dips into the you taking extra damage thing. Between having, no armor rating and taking double damage, you're just kind of standing there getting like destroyed some of the time, which definitely makes content harder to learn and a melee a little bit harder to learn as well. And I think that definitely cuts into the ease of use of the melee combat style. And then the final thing for the ease of use that I'm going to talk about is going to be the forced melee distance that you have to stand, especially when you're using dual wields and I guess a 2H that's not a scythe. You're forced to stand in melee distance, and this can make certain mechanics and stuff a little bit more difficult. Again, I think mostly when you're learning, it makes it more difficult. And then once you're more experienced, it's really not that bad. But it does make certain things a little bit more difficult and tedious, and you have to be like better with movement abilities. So that definitely cuts into the ease of use factor as well. And from my experience, when I was doing some Zamorak 500%, or I guess Zamorak in general on phase 7, there was a steep learning curve, kind of figuring out where to stand, where you could and couldn't like bladed dive through, where you couldn't surge. Like there's a lot of weird blocked tiles and hard angles you have to run around that make it really annoying and technical to learn, especially at Zamorak, because if you make one mistake, you just like get destroyed by the big red hit, and that's definitely really annoying. And then your like berserk runs out, and it kind of snowballs into a lot of problems. So I definitely find the forced melee distance thing to be kind of annoying. And personally speaking, I would almost like melee to have a like scythe range for all of its combat, and then the scythe have a 3-tile range. I just feel like the forced melee distance thing is really, really limiting for melee, so much so that it makes it like just a cumbersome, annoying combat style to use. But again, most of those problems are, learning issues, and once you learn how to do the content correctly, you can really avoid most of those issues by just knowing what you're doing a little bit more. So yeah, I think the ease of use overall, somewhere in between necromancy and range, and then magic doesn't exist in the game right now, so no point in talking about that. Next up is going to be the damage output. So melee is capable of pumping out a lot of damage, but from what I've noticed, the burst damage that melee is capable of doing is about equal to range burst damage. So, it's not as good as range DPS overall. Like your burst damage is about equal to range, your sustained damage is lower than range, and then you kind of have like a bleed rotation that you can kind of do outside of your berserk that kind of offsets some of that, but definitely not quite, it's not quite up to where range is at. Same thing with necromancy. Melee can burst way higher than necromancy, but from what I found, again, necromancy just has better sustained damage overall because you can do the 5 death skulls and then you can go into like a tier 95 rotation. So it does have some pretty powerful things to use outside of your death skull rotation. And melee, again, the bleed rotation just isn't as good as those like range and necromancy. So although the damage output is pretty decent, it's definitely not as good as some of the other combat styles in the game. But I do find the burst damage is pretty useful at a lot of places, like Zamorak again, for example. You can nuke the pad and 1 cycle P7 very easily at 500% and get no mechanics at all. And that's with a fraction of the cost of the range gear, like about half the cost of range gear. So it is definitely a cheaper way to get, some pretty high burst damage output. So I think that is probably where melee's best use case is bosses like that, if you don't want to, go through the process of buying range gear or actually having to use range gear. So yeah, I think there are some advantages there, but it definitely, I don't know, it seems outclassed. So next up is going to be the cost. So You can see on screen here the cost of range gear, or I mean the cost of melee gear is about 6 billion for best in slot. So compared to range, it's just over half the price. And to be honest with you, I think that seems pretty fair considering what you're able to do with melee. You know, similar burst damage, a little bit lower sustained damage, but it's a little bit more technical and harder to, not really harder to use, but it's a little bit more technical to use. So I think the cost is overall pretty fair for melee. 6 bill for best in slot isn't like, it's not the worst thing in the world. Again, it's kind of in the middle of necromancy and ranged. So overall, finally, I'm going to be going over kind of my just overall thoughts about melee combat, and kind of if you should get it or not is probably going to be mostly these thoughts. So I think it's really good that melee feels like a fair middle ground between necromancy and range from a lot of different perspectives. I think it like fits into the game really nicely for like being that middle ground style. But there are a lot of little problems that I've noticed with melee. The first problem is going to be the overabundance of gear, especially competing gear. This is a huge problem that melee has. If you notice, there's the Scourge, the main hand Lang, you have the Easy K as a physical item that you might want to use, as well as maybe a Scythe, the Masterwork Spear. You have the Jaws of the Abyss, as well as the Vestment Helmet, and then you obviously have the Gloves of Passage, as well as Cinderbanes. So there's just a ton of gear that competes with like similar slots that I find really is annoying with melee, and it makes the combat style feel a lot worse to use. Like you're losing out on the Scourge damage to be getting tier 95 damage and the special attack from the Langs that you can't, you know, switch to the Scourge and still get that special attack. So it kind of leads to little problems like that. And I think there is an easy solution to this, and it's start merging items together, like merge the Lang and the main hand, or the Scourge and the main hand Lang together. That solves that problem. Merge the Jaws of the Abyss and the Vestment Helmet together solves that problem. So I think merging some items together, like maybe even merging the Easy K with the Masterwork Spear, would be another great way to solve that problem, because then you don't have to chuck it in an EOF. And you'd probably still get that tier 95 damage, you know? So I think there are some really good solutions to these problems, but considering we get about one update every 6 months, and Magic is the thing that's going to be getting updated next most likely, we will probably never really see these changes, unfortunately. Next up is going to be Meteor Strike. So Meteor Strike, unlike range or magic, there is no way to reduce the adrenaline cost of Meteor Strike. The Vestment set kind of helps with this, but it's not quite good enough to really make it, you know, feel good to use. I think there needs to be something to reduce the adrenaline cost of Meteor Strike, just so it's not so annoying to use. I've noticed when you Meteor Strike, unless you're using like a range Hydrix Bolt Jericho switch or something like that, it can be really annoying to use Meteor Strike and then get back up to 100% to Berserk and then still get the most out of that Meteor Strike, because by the time you get to 100%, you've already lost a fair amount of your critical strike buff, and it's just really annoying. So I think something definitely needs to be done to help deal with the Meteor Strike adrenaline cost. But again, like the gear switch problem, we probably won't see this for another year or two, considering the update speed that Jagex seems capable of right now, which, yeah, unlucky, I guess. So I already kind of touched on this, but I find it really annoying to learn certain mechanics and certain bosses and stuff because of the melee distance and damage taken problems. Again, these aren't really the biggest deal once you learn how to do something, but learning things can definitely be really annoying, especially like I mentioned, phase 7 of Zamorak. Like trying to blade a dive or trying to barge and getting like, you can't do that, you can't reach your target, and just seeing that in your chat box can be really, really annoying. And yeah, I definitely find those like having to be melee distance and like some of the movement things with like hard blocked tiles and stuff like that to be really, you know, cumbersome with melee. But again, you can like learn where to stand and just completely mitigate that issue. Next up is the glass cannon concept they went with for melee. Doesn't make any sense, and to me it just seems really stupid. Like, considering melee doesn't do as much burst damage or sustain damage as range, the idea that melee is supposed to be this glass cannon build with tier 70 armor taking double damage has just like completely, you know, failed. like it doesn't do the most damage in the game, so why would it be considered the glass cannon? I don't know. It just it seems like that was a failed idea that didn't really work out very well. And yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how you solve this issue, or if it's really an issue in the first place. But to me, it just seems really dumb that melee is like set up as like a glass cannon, yet it doesn't do the most damage. It's like, I don't know. And then the next problem that I've noticed with melee is the bleeds. So this is mostly an issue with team bosses, but if you don't know, if I have a bleed on the target, let's say I put dismember on the target and then somebody else uses dismember, their dismember will override my dismember. So if you have multiple meleeers on a team boss, if you're both going into your bleed rotation at the same time, you're just going to start overriding each other's bleeds and doing significantly less damage. And this is definitely a huge issue with team bosses, and I think this is something that they should have tried to fix. I mean, I don't really know exactly how you can fix it given the way that the game is like coded, but there's definitely probably solutions to this issue that should be addressed, I think, sooner rather than later, because it seems really dumb that you can't have two meleeers on the same team. Like, it's just weird, or they can't be doing the bleed rotation at the same time, which means that one has to start with the bleed rotation and then Zerk after, and the other one starts with Berserk. Like, I don't know, it just doesn't seem that great. And finally, the final kind of my thoughts here is going to be, even though we had the hit cap be increased to 30,000, it already seems like that needs to be higher with melee. Like, you can Chaos Roar your overpower and it's double capping the hits, and it honestly could probably be hitting like a single hit of like 60,000 with Chaos Roar. So you could hit up to 120,000 damage. Like, I definitely see why the hit cap is in place, but it also kind of feels bad to know that like we're already hitting the limits of what was put into the game like last month. So yeah, I don't know. It definitely almost seems like we need a higher hit cap already, which is a bit questionable considering the current hit cap is like a month old. But yeah, those are kind of my thoughts about melee. I guess the overall conclusion is that melee is, you know, more accessible, easier to use, and cheaper than range. The damage output is similar, but not quite as good. And then it is, you know, more expensive and more effort to use than necromancy, but it can burst way higher, and it has about the same amount of sustained damage. So hopefully that helps some of you guys decide whether or not you want to pick up best in slot melee. I think best in slot melee is a fairly reasonable value for the cost. And yeah, let me know what you guys think about melee in the comment section below. If you guys like melee right now or you don't like it right now. I want to know what other people think about melee, because personally, I'm kind of on the fence with it. There are a lot of problems that I think melee has, but I also think melee is pretty fun to use, and hitting those double 30k overpowers is kind of fun. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts about melee. Alright, so now I'm going to be giving my kind of final conclusions about melee. Like I've said throughout this video, I think melee is a really, really good middle ground between necromancy and range, from, you know, cost to the effort to use it to the skill expression. I think melee is relatively decent in that regard, and I think melee will be good for people who you know, want to be getting those really decent boss times, you know, like pad skipping Zamoraks and stuff like that, but they don't have 10 bill to spend on the gear. I think 5.7 bill is a little bit more reasonable. Also, I think melee has a lot of room for like potentially downgrading, where, you know, you don't need to get the easy K, to be honest. Like, the easy K is good, I guess, but it's really not that good. Like, out of all the tier 95 weapons in the game, the easy K is easily, well, the FSOA is the worst, but if magic didn't exist, the easy K is easily the weakest, so you could just not get that weapon. It would be fine. So there's that. You could also, you know, maybe even not get the main hand delaying and just use like a Scourge and the Masterwork Spear as like your whole kit. If you noticed during the cost section of the video, there was a little line at the bottom saying without the easy K and without the main hand delaying, and I'm pretty sure that was like 3.2 bill or something like that. And that setup is pretty like similar. So I do think there are quite a few downgrades that melee has that makes it a much more, you know, user-friendly ramp up to best in slot where, you could buy something, use it, and it would still be strong. And then you could, buy something else and use it and it's getting stronger. And then once you get everything, it's very strong at the end. Whereas something like range, it's pretty much you buy the bow of the last guardian and then you pretty much need to get the rest of the stuff. Otherwise it's kind of trash. So yeah, I think melee is set up really nicely in that regard. I also think that melee is really good for people who want to put in an extremely high amount of effort as well. I think there's a massive amount of skill expression with melee, from the glove switches to, microing your rotation. It has a lot of different abilities. So there's like a ton of rotations. There's also a bunch of different things you could put in EOFs for like niche situations. So yeah, I think there's a lot of room for, skill expression with melee, which I think is really good. But I will also say on the other end, I think melee has a lot of room, or a lot of use for revolution bars, because most of your damage comes from the actual abilities themselves and not, weapon special attacks or EOFs. You can build some really solid revolution bars with melee that make it, pretty good for people doing like low effort combat revolution and AFKing and stuff like that. So I definitely think melee has a lot of really good use cases, in all regards of combat, which I think is definitely really good. But yeah, that's kind of my overall thoughts about melee. Let me know what you guys think about melee, if you guys have been using melee or if you haven't used it yet, or if this video, maybe sways you to go and buy melee, pick it up. Definitely let me know in the comment section below what you guys think about this. And as always, guys, if you made it this far in the video, definitely drop a like on it. It does help promote the channel. And thanks for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.